Hello, everybody. Hi. Hi. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. And good evening. Welcome to the Rocky Mountain College of Art and Design. I'm Gretchen Marie Schaefer. I'm the director of the Visiting Artist, Scholar, and Designer program. For guests to our campus, REMCAD was founded in 1963, and it offers undergraduate and graduate degrees in a number of creative fields. Tonight's lecture is part of REMCAD's Visiting Artist, Scholar, and Designer program. The VASD program explores critical, diverse, and creative inquiry. This interdisciplinary initiative enriches the academic experience at REMCAD and serves the greater Denver metro community. This year, the program is considering concepts of identity in a year-long lecture series. Over the course of the fall and spring semesters, this series will investigate the ways creative thinkers are presenting, challenging, and manipulating identities in art, design, and in culture. By surveying a section of viewpoints on this subject, we will explore various manifestations of today's protean self. And we begin the series with tonight's lecture, Surveillance, Data, and Learning to Love Big Brother by Hasan Elahi. Born in Bangladesh, Hasan is an artist based in Baltimore and is an associate professor at the University of Maryland. Through a variety of media, including video, photography, and installation, Hasan's work examines issues of surveillance and borders. National and international exhibition of the artist's work include the Pompidou Center, the Sundance Film Festival, the Hermitage, and the Venice Biennale, among many others. The artist presents lectures about his work extensively, including at the Tate Modern, the American Association of Artificial Intelligence, which was held at Stanford, and the International Association of Privacy Professionals. Recognition for his artistic achievement includes grants from the Creative Capital Foundation and the Ford Foundation Philip Morris National Fellowship, as well as reviews in the New York Times Magazine and in The Guardian. Tonight, Hasan Elahi's lecture will address the consequences of living under perpetual surveillance. A decade ago, for reasons he will describe, Hasan created an extensive online database which publicly displays a thorough yet intentionally selective depiction of his private life. In an overview of his work, Hasan will present the creative choices he has made to both subvert and to engage big data. The incessant development of technology and its intimate absorption into our daily lives, paired with massive data collection, contribute to an unprecedented blurring and redefining of privacy. Artists and designers have the opportunity to play in these murky areas of exponential change, especially when it's too early to have rules and may be or ever be able to identify the game. Hasan is one of these artists at play. And now I'd like you all to join me in welcoming Hasan Elahi.
Thank you. Hi, folks. Wow, we got it. Thank you, Gretchen, and thanks for having me here. I mean, it's such an amazing evening that I'm kind of, amazed that you're here instead of like hanging out outside or something. Anyway, and it's really great to also see a lot of folks that I didn't even realize that I was going to be running into here. So I don't see, I saw Karen earlier and Avni and Teresa and thank you so much for the rest of you coming here. And some of you are like, I kind of had to be here. but I really appreciate you coming out. So I want to go over a lot of things. I'm going to try to show you quite a bit, but that's me. That arrow is supposed to be pointing at me, and that arrow will make sense in a little bit. So maybe I should like stand right here. Is that okay? So I'm pretty easy to find in more than one way. So. If you want to, I'm going to try to show a ton of stuff today, but obviously, it's one of those things. And I think, when I'm talking to artists and art students and think it wasn't that long ago that I was in one of these seats at school. It was about less than 20 years, about a little over 20 years ago. And I remember, back then we'd have the slides, and you have like those 20 slides, and you have to like do all those things. And I kept thinking to myself, how in the world am I going to fill up 20 slides in this? So, you have like alternate shots and details of details. And all of a sudden it turned into, how do I fit 20 years of work in, 40 minutes? So I'm going to try to go over a lot with you, but if you go to my website, which is, you can go to elahi.org or elahi.umd. .edu, and you can see a lot of it. But one of the things, and when Gretchen and I were talking about the earlier, in planning this event and this lecture, we thought it might be a good idea to talk about works that you normally wouldn't see, or that don't show up very often. So we're going to dig up really old work, or like really old work that, anything older than this, I'm way too embarrassed to show you. And even then, I kind of cringe at this. So this is about 20 years, this is from 1994. And I should explain to you how I actually ended up as an artist, because I think in one of, I never actually intended on it, and I just kind of stumbled on it. And I was one of those kids that, I never finished high school, so never got a GED, but I started college and had way too many credits and nothing to make a degree in. Some of you probably have been in that situation where you've studied too many things for too many years, and you're trying to make up this, no, you need 23 credits in this, and you need 48 here, but it kind of all came together where I was like, how is this going to work? I mean, I have all these credits, and by that, I even lost track of the number of schools I went to. And I kept transferring out, I kept switching majors. There was one school at one time that said, this is your last time you could switch majors, because back then there were all these like paper files. They would actually switch it, and they ran out of lines at the bottom. And I was like, okay, so then I just left school. I went to another school. But it was really in the arts. It was really through the arts that I was able to use my interest in the arts as a platform to allow me to study anything and everything to any extent. So if I want to make work about some physics principle, I actually have to go learn a thing or two about that and follow it in that way. In the same way where if it's something about 19th century British poetry. You have to go in and do it. So it worked as a really nice container, or as a springboard, to let me bring all my interests together. So I'm putting all this thing together, and I actually have a graduate degree in printmaking, and I absolutely hate ink, and I absolutely hate the texture of newsprint, and I can't stand the smell of it, which is a really bad quality for someone interested in printmaking. And so I'd make all these prints that didn't even have any like ink in them. They were just these prints that you couldn't even see. They just kind of looked like flattened pieces of paper. But what I was really interested in was not necessarily the techniques or the material of printmaking, but the purpose of a print and what a print does. And if you think about it in terms of, at least in Western terminology, history, if you go back, and Gutenberg and the printing press and how you'd use the central one, the origination of point A to multiple point Bs. So I was really interested in this multiple, the idea of the multiple, and using printmaking as a basis for the multiple. And if you think about it, I mean, if you follow the lineage of printmaking from the relief prints, and also think about the technology involved here, because, mid-1400s, we have this technology where we take these pieces of wood and move them around and ink them, and then all of a sudden now you have two of them. I mean, think about where we were at that time. And really think about where literacy was. I mean, prior to 1450s, I mean, the book, I mean, that was the Bible. The book and Bible were synonymous, and who had access to the book? The king and a handful of his inner circle. So who had access to literacy? So it was really the advent of the printing press is what generated an expansion of knowledge, and thus really generated an expansion of the middle class. So that was really my interest in printmaking, is the idea of the replicated information and the replicated word, and then treating that. And then I was also interested in this idea of physicality and virtuality. And these are things that I didn't even understand when I was working. One of the things in school, when we're in school, we kind of like we're working on certain projects and we kind of have an idea of it, but and I think a lot of artists, a lot of us work in a way where we work almost compulsively or impulsively, but we may not necessarily fully understand why we're doing what we're doing at the moment, and sometimes we're a little behind on that. So when I was creating these works, I was like, okay, yeah, I really like working with light, and I was making, but I didn't really put two and two together until several years later, where what I was really interested in was this relationship between physicality and virtuality, where the physical material versus the virtual light, using light as a 2D versus 3D versus 4D versus an ephemeral experience, and that dematerialization. I didn't necessarily have that vocabulary to fully explain this work then, but it only makes sense in retrospect in looking at this. So, so this is, let me show you another couple of early works. I went to grad school outside of Detroit. And it's kind of weird talking about grad school right now because it's one of those things where it just seems like such a lifetime ago, and the work, in a way, has changed a lot, but it actually hasn't changed. And I think a lot of it, it's kind of like, I relate this to a lot of musicians. And, there's certain musicians you'll hear, and you hear them at 20 and you hear them at 60. They're completely different, but you still hear that trajectory, and you still know it's them. And you have this really long career. So those are the things that I think it's a similarity. So 8 Mile Road is the northern boundary of Detroit, and for those that missed the Eminem movie, it's literally a wall in every possible way. So I would go up and I would drive up and down 8 Mile Road, back and forth, just in my car, just going back and forth, and photographing every intersection, looking north, looking south, and then came back and created these prints, which were placed on these small pieces of non-glare glass. And then there was a video that was projected on top. And actually, originally what I was doing was I was building this contraption in the studio where the lights would move and the way the lights would hit the reflective glass versus the parts that were coated with reflective liquid and parts that weren't. It was really a kind of a trying to understand optics, and really kind of an exercise in the studio of really trying to make the light and trying to use the light as a physical material. And it was really at that moment, it was kind of a thing that hit me. It was like, well, why am I doing this? Why am I doing this as a physical object? Why don't I project the light on? Why don't I project the moving light on? And coming to this realization of working with video. So a lot of artists work with video, out of photography or out of cinema or out of performance. But this one was really trying to understand light from a very physical matter, trying to understand it as the physical properties of it. The other thing that's actually really interesting that happened then, that I didn't fully realize until many years later, is that when you pause that video, or in this case it was a 16mm film loop that went over it. So when I would put this, when you would pause it, you got zero information in the projection. And it was only it's only when you saw the frames that came before that frame and the frames that come after that frame that you actually can make sense of what you're seeing. Does that make sense? So you can't take one frame out and get a full set of information. You really have to look at the full data set. And really, there's an interesting thing that happens in working in this type of moving media, is that the motion is what gives it content. It's the sequence of images created that creates the content, and not necessarily a still image by itself, because the single point of data by itself without the contextualization gives you very little information. As you can see in this image, the only image that you see are the ones that are printed on the glass. The projected image, you don't see anything. I'm going to show you a couple of other really, really old ones. So, it's working outside of Detroit, it's inevitable that you're going to be dealing with a lot of industrial decay. I mean, the town is just, there's the grand pastures of Detroit with every type of industrial relic you could imagine throughout the entire city. And so there's all these gigantic factories, or skeletons of factories in many cases, sometimes dilapidated and abandoned. And they're huge. They're like a quarter mile by a quarter mile. And I would go there with my video camera and I'd just walk around the perimeter as far as I can go and just keep circling them over and over and over, just with my camera just pointing out. And it wasn't that I was really it wasn't that I was making a documentary of the space. I was just trying to record this perimeter, trying to outline this geography over and over and over. And in that process, I came back and I took these old monitors and ripped them apart. I had these old black and white televisions, which I would not do this today, understanding electricity and understanding voltage. It's probably a good thing I didn't understand it then, because there's no way I would have done it if I actually fully realized what it could have done to me. But I decided to put these monitors up, and they were suspended from the ceiling, and they were put about 3 feet away from the wall. And there was a projection of a map that went over, and where the projection where the shadow of the monitor landed on the map is the actual physical location of it. So down here is the old Buick Olds Cadillac plant. Up there is the old, it's an old Ford plant in Highland Park. I think that's the Mack Avenue Chrysler plant over there. I mean, this is an old, I haven't actually talked about this piece in almost 10 years, so I have to kind of go back a little bit and try to even remember what some of these are. Anyway, so some of the monitors are really high up, and there's no way you could actually see because the monitors were all pointing up. And then I decided, okay, let me go get these rear view mirrors from the factories that each of these assembly lines came out of. So one of them is from like an old Studebaker, one of them is from like an old Buick. Like the mirror that came from each of those assembly plants. And then you stood in a specific point in the center, and you could watch all the monitors simultaneously through the rear view mirrors. And this idea of monitoring, I mean, the word surveillance wasn't even in my vocabulary in relation to art practice at that time. I didn't even know that I was going to be working with this type of content. But it's, again, those are the things that only make sense going backwards and revisiting the work rather than trying to understand it at the moment. And I think it's one of those things that we do a lot. As artists, we have this amazing luxury of being able to go back and revisit and re-explore. It's not like the sciences where you get research funding to do a project and you do your research and then you move on to the next problem. And then you get the next set of problems and then you move on. Whereas in the arts, we have this amazing ability to be able to go and try to solve the problem over and over. And each time we solve it, we look at it from a different perspective. So this is, in a way, this was a very early surveillance work, but it really had, at that time, the working with surveillance was the last thing on my mind, or even the concept of then I would realize that this would be a real big topic just a few years later. Let me go so in 1999 I moved to Tampa, Florida, and then shortly after I started creating these types of work. So these are it's a little bird. So I was creating these videos, but the videos that I made, similarly to those videos that you saw earlier with the film, where they weren't really videos as film, but they were videos as sculptural material or light. So I was doing these videos, but none of these videos actually moved because they were only one frame. And I think some of you folks that are in film and video, you know that, you don't really, is a one-frame video a video? It's basically a photograph on a TV screen. And when you put the photograph on a TV screen, you're expecting movement. And so when you saw this, so basically what happened is, and this was also an interesting way of looking at how signal process and how signal fades. So this was way back in the days of VHS tapes and VHS players. So there was a single VHS tape deck and then the signal went from there to the first monitor, then to the second monitor, to the third monitor, and then went all the way around the perimeter of the gallery to 14 monitors. And by the time you got to the last monitor, you saw nothing. You just saw static because the image fully deteriorated. This is, and we don't actually see that static anymore. In analog TV versus digital, now, when you, instead of seeing static, you just see a blue screen. Or your image just goes black, no signal. That's what you see on your HD TVs now. So looking at it as a very as a material of that time. So looking at this deteriorated image of this bird, which is the single video image. But I would have people coming up to me and telling me how the bird, they experienced this very beautiful image of this bird getting up and flying away. I know the bird doesn't fly away because it's only one frame. But because you wanted that bird to fly away, you would see it. You would impose that image. And so sometimes some of those images that we see in our heads are way more powerful than the images we'll ever see with our eyes. So this was this interesting way of looking at, can you create a dialogue, or can you create a system where your viewer sees something that you want them to see, but you're actually not showing. So it's kind of that experiment where you put a dot here, and a dot here, and you say, what do you see? Very few people say 3 dots, they say a triangle. So it's, putting together bits and pieces and putting together meaning by not showing what I want to show. So really, how do I get you to see something that I want you to see, but I'm not showing it to you in a physical, or in a visual manner, in a perceptual manner. So it was I did all these works with Wile E. Coyote back then, but that's a whole different story. This is an important piece I want to show you because this is, I think, the first time I was dealing with work that was more of a civic conscious, or looking at the ideas of the role of the citizen and the role of civic engagement. So in 1999, after I moved to Florida, right at that time, in that summer, there was a very traumatic experience that took place on Surfside, which is just the town north of Miami Beach. And Surfside, politically, demographically, culturally, it is almost the polar opposite to Miami Beach. So, by the way, do you folks have heard of this term, wet feet, dry feet? Yes, any international relations people? So it's the name of a official U.S. Immigration policy, and it only applies to Cubans. And I swear, it sounds like something that someone came up with at a bar. So the way this works is that if you're a Cuban refugee and you arrive into the U.S., if you are apprehended while your feet are wet, you get sent back, meaning if you're apprehended in the water. If your feet are dry, if you're on dry ground, you can stay. If you're Haitian, you get sent back regardless of whether your feet are wet or dry. If you're Dominican, doesn't matter. But this only applies to Cubans, and this has to be, your feet have to be dry. So there's a group of Cuban refugees that are about to make landfall in this time, and our Coast Guard hosed them down with water cannons and pushed them back into the sea, where they were apprehended, and because their feet were wet, they were sent back. So, here we are talking about these ideals of liberty and justice and freedom, these really big abstract concepts, and yet we have these rules, we have these laws, as crazy and cockamamie as they are, but yet we still only play by them when we want to play by them. So this was something that I was very disturbed by this event. So I tried to find out where this took place. It was a rather futile attempt, but eventually I located the patch of beach. And it's a typical idyllic South Florida beach, just absolutely gorgeous. It just looks like, the South Florida. But I left my camera and just put the camera on the ground and just let the waves just go in and out, in a way of trying to record what happened, in a way of trying to understand, can the location, can geography remember what happened there? Earlier today, I was eating in what I guess was a morgue here. Can that space remember what happened there? Does geography remember trauma? Why is it that we say, on this ground, General so-and-so defeated this troops, and thus this is why it's, why is that so important? Why do we celebrate that piece of territory? Why do we celebrate that one point? So it was this attempt to try to see, can the location, can the place remember, and what type of a memory does that have? And so it was a very futile attempt. It's kind of like you really can't see it. So it's kind of like I'm trying to capture sound with smells. I'm trying to capture something or another. It's a different type of sensory experience. And where the two just don't line up, they're disjointed. But so when I came back, and this has been reinstalled a couple of times, but in the end there was a 7-channel installation where the videos just kept infinitely looping over and over and over, and it was just this waves coming back and forth. But they were modified a bit. Let me move over a little bit. So this is like probably my hit song. Like shortly after that, my whole FBI thing, and I think this is one of those things. I think, Richard, you sent out quite a bit with the media, and this is what gets the the big things in the media and so on. But I'll go super quick with this. So because I really want to show you the works that you can't hear about online or something. So I got taken in by the FBI in this place in Detroit. And basically I was asked, where were you, what were you doing? And basically they were like, where were you September 12th? And this is exactly where I was on September 12th. You can see that at 10 o'clock I paid my storage. 10:30 I met with Judith, who was one of the grad students at the time. 12 to 3 taught my intro class. 3 to 6 taught my advanced class. You can see that I went to a party at Ryan and Mandy's house on Saturday night, 7:30. You can see all this stuff that's going on. And I'm glad that I had this records, and because I don't know what would have happened if I didn't. But we all kind of have something on it, so you can tell like at what time were you at this point. It's like if you're randomly asked, where were you April 4th? I don't know, but chances are if you look up through your emails and you look up through your text, you can probably trigger your memory enough to tell where you were at what point. Anyway, so this was the storage unit, by the way, that I was supposedly hoarding explosives in Tampa. But never mind. At the end, the FBI explained to me that they received a report that an Arab man had fled who was hoarding explosives. And never mind, I'm not Arab. Never mind, it wasn't the 12th. Never mind, it wasn't explosives. But if you see something, say something. Even if you only see it in your head and you're kind of making it up. And look, it's one of those things where anyone that talks to me for more than a minute realizes I'm not exactly a terrorist threat. But the system simply doesn't trust itself. The FBI agent knew I was harmless. Otherwise, why would he let me go home that night? Why wouldn't he keep me in custody? Because it was just like the guy's like, oh, this is a complete bogus tip. Everything's okay, but he couldn't say that. He couldn't officially confirm that because he was not trusted by its own system. And the system has to go through an entire cycle. Think about what that does. This is crazy. How much resources are we wasting on this? But I'm kind of glad that they did, because otherwise I could be in Guantanamo right now, and that's not cool. That's not cool. So, so we spent 6 months going in and out of this building. All sorts of crazy questions, all sorts of and then every single time they would let me go back home. And then they'd call me again and said, hey, come back, we have a few more questions for you. Okay, I'll be over, and I get over there, tell them a few other things. There was questions like, why is it that you've been to almost every enemy state of the United States? It's like, wow, yeah, now that you think about it, we do have a lot of enemies. Things like that. It's like, what am I supposed to say? So basically, at the end of it, I was finally cleared after 6 months and 9 consecutive polygraphs. And if any of you have had polygraphs, it's not like the movies. So if you've had polygraphs, you know what I'm talking about. It's like, it's not like the scratching paper and the buzzers. It's just wires, and you're just sitting there, and there's someone just asking super, monotonous voice. Yeah, you're nodding your head, because you've probably been through that. Yeah, it's not fun. It's a very sedative experience, where you kind of doze off, and I don't even know what I said on some of it, but I'm glad I said what I did. Because otherwise it could have ended up real ugly. But in the end, so the guy that administering the polygraph leaves the room and said, okay, everything's fine. I was like, yeah, I know everything's fine. That's what I've been trying to tell you guys for the last 6 months. Can you guys give me a letter saying everything's okay? Because all we need is the next guy not to get the next memo, and here we go all over again. How can we avoid this? And if you understand the judicial system, good luck trying to get a judge to say you're not guilty of something you never did. Our laws just don't work that way. So I said, guys, I travel a lot. How do we avoid this? So at that time, the FBI agent says, here's some phone numbers. Give us a call. We'll take care of it. So ever since then, I'd call my FBI agent, tell him where I was going. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I wanted to let them know. It's like, look, guys, I'm not running off somewhere. I'm going to this place. I'm going to be back on this day. This is what I'm doing. Don't freak out. And then, a few weeks later, I'd call them up again and tell them the things, and then I'd tell them a few more things. Then it got to be the point where he'd recognize my voice on the phone, and then I'd write him really long letters, really long emails. I'd take pictures. I'd make websites for him. You know, like, and I'd like tell him all sorts of stuff. I mean, like, I'd write like thousands of words. And, you know, like sometimes, you know, you think you're connecting with someone, you're telling them all your life story. And, you know, he'd always reply, "Thank you, be safe." So, really, really like unbalanced relationship here. Not healthy, not healthy. But I'm sure some of you have been there. You've been there. You know, like when you get that non-communicative person, you think they're a good listener, but they're actually just like, I don't know what they're doing. Anyway, so this went on for a while, and I was like, wait a minute. Why is this one agent so special? Why is it that only he gets to know what I'm doing? So I decided, this was, you know, about a dozen years ago, I took my old Nokia 6600 phone. I don't know if some of you actually remember that, but this is like, you know, yeah, you remember that? That was just horrible. It was like, what, 3/4 inch thick, and it was like, and you had to like hit like a whole bunch of times just to get like one text out with those T9. I mean, that just seems so ancient now, doesn't it? I mean, now, like, you know, in the world of like what, 6 generations of iPhones, it's so quickly changed. But I wrote some real clunky code and turned it into an ankle bracelet, into a tracking device. That's what I would call it. So basically, this is what it is. And let me show you a live demo of it. So this is what it looks like when you go to it. So you can probably recognize those doors. And I'm kind of, there's some mountains over here, and there's some flat land over here. I mean, you know, sorry, let's go back over there so you can actually see it a little bit easier. So, okay, I'm kind of in the middle-ish, western-ish of the country over there. And then we can go all the way in, and then, you know, you can see that there's some buildings that are happening there. And we can go, and then there's me right there. So it was weird, like when I first started this project, where people, you know, talking about watching yourself as a pixel. It was such an odd experience of identifying yourself as a pixel on a screen. But think about it, you know, now it's like back in the old days, meaning just like less than 3 years ago, we used to open up that map, we'd like unfold that map, and would go, we're here. You would locate your body to the space, to the geography. Now, we pull that phone out, we hit that little button with the little arrow, and you become the center of your map. The map recenters to you. You become the center. So this is something that I think is a very crucial change, I think, in our understanding of geography and understanding physical and virtual space. So now we all have individualized maps, because my map here will look different than your map, which will look different than your map, which will look different than your map. So this hyper-customization. So this idea of looking at yourself as data. And we're all creating these like data doppelgangers that are just floating around, kind of like doing its thing. I mean, you know, we've been communicating, our data has been communicating, I don't know how long, but we just met for the first time today. So I think that and we all do this. We all do this. So I've decided that, you know, I've decided to share everything with the FBI, so they know that on October 30th of 2006, I used that urinal. They know that on this time, on March 26th, I made a call. This is actually outside of Moscow Airport. This is at a Staples. This is at a mall in Jakarta, Indonesia. I can tell you exactly all of this. I can tell you who I was with, what I was doing. But this is all like things that I share with the FBI, because they need to know. They need to know. So I've decided to take this approach of, okay, guys, you want to watch me? I'm totally cool with that, but I can watch myself way better than you guys ever could, and get a level of detail that you'll never have access to. I think that's really important, because, you know, it's like we can be, you know, it's, instead of fearing that surveillance camera, instead of fearing this concept of Big Brother, why not just turn it around? You know, we tend to think of, okay, oh, wait, there's a camera there, we should be here. Well, no, we all have cameras on us right now. Sometimes more than one, sometimes 2 and 3. I mean, if you have an iPad, if you have your laptop, if you have your cell phone, if you have a digital, I mean, you basically have 4 cameras on you. And for the first time, we may actually be exceeding more cameras than people. And particularly when you look at public cameras, you know, the minute you step outside, I think there's a couple of cameras right there in the gallery. So, I mean, they're everywhere. But we also have our own cameras. So it's not just a matter of this, of being, it's not just a one-way street. And think about it. You know, it wasn't that long ago when say, a politically sensitive situation where you'd have your camera or you'd have your film taken away. Any journalist that's over 40 has experienced this at one time or another. But these days, good luck. By the time they're doing that, the photo's already on Flickr or YouTube, and there's another camera taking a picture of the camera being taken away. I mean, we saw this, and we see this on a regular basis. We saw it in Tunisia, we saw it in Libya, we saw it in Ferguson. So this is, so in a way, it's changing the dynamics of power. It's changing this. And really, in a way of putting all this out there, I'm borrowing the simplest of all principles of economics, of supply and demand. And if I flood the market with all my information, then therefore the information that the FBI has no value. Therefore, it devalues their currency. And I understand on an individual basis this is merely symbolic. But if 300 million people start doing this, and in many cases we already are, it will force a change in our entire way we collect information. It's no longer about collecting information, but about analyzing information. It's about what information do we already have. We can store insane amounts of information. What do we do with it? You and I were talking earlier, it's like you're recording, it's like, but how do I actually listen to all these thousands of hours of audio that I've recorded? Well, that's the problem, it's the analysis. It's not the acquiring that's the problem. So let me show you a couple of other things. Let me move back over here. So in a way, this is really important because, and it kind of looks as the idea of camouflage. And it's really what I'm doing in data. So I'm kind of hiding in data. I'm putting so much noise out there that, I'm telling you everything, but I'm also telling you nothing. So in a way, I think in a way to regain our privacy and to understand how to take back our privacy, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that the system is going to be different. And detaching is not an option because you may not post anything about you, but the person sitting next to you might be posting about you. And next thing you know, that there's a piece of information about you here and there, and someone can run with it and it can be horribly wrong. I mean, I'm sure, it's like Rick Santorum had a real horrible experience, or maybe not horrible, but unpleasant experience when you put his name in Google. Something that wasn't terribly flattering. And it wasn't one of those things that you can say, hey, and he's been trying to tell Google, hey, delete this makes me look bad. But that's not how the net works. You can't delete things. Things don't go away, but you can bury it. You could bury it to page 35. But in order to bury it to page 35, you need 34 pages of information. And you'd much rather be in control of those 34 pages of information than have someone else making up 34 pages of information about you, because it may be like that Rick Santorum thing, where it's not exactly the most flattering thing. Anyway, so going back to this, I want to talk a little bit about warfare and camouflage. When we think of camouflage, what do you think of? You think of like the trees and woods and like leaves and all that stuff. I mean, so if you notice the camouflage that our soldiers are wearing today, so historically camouflage was used so the silhouette of the body would be broken in battle, so the enemy could not distinguish between the soldier and the landscape. So what does the new camo look like? Get these little pixels. You ever notice the color on them? Kind of grayish, greenish, whitish. You ever seen trees that color anywhere? You ever seen terrain that color? No. Because it's not meant for terrain, or it's not meant for landscape. It's meant so the enemy cannot distinguish between the soldier and the noise in the night vision goggles. That's why the color is so similar to noise in night vision. So we have a real significant change. So similarly to how we look at ourselves in a map and we become the center of our map and we become that geography, we've embedded this technology. In the same way, our warfare has also embedded this technology, where we no longer have a need for the soldier to blend into the landscape, but we now have a need for the soldier to blend into the mechanism of warfare. In the same way, we've also externalized a lot of our memory. If you think about it, how many phone numbers do you know off the top of your head? Yeah. How many did you know before your cell phone? And this, I mean, I realize some of you are probably like, what? I don't remember ever living without a cell phone. But think about, like, before you had your cell phone, how many did you actually remember? Yeah. Yeah. So what do? We've externalized this memory. So what used to be in our head is now in our hand. And because now that machine can remember it for me. Half the time, I don't even know the numbers. I just touch their name and it calls me. It just calls for me. Again, this externalization and this storage that's taking place. So I think this is something to keep in mind, is that as we externalize more and more and more, we're going to create these huge piles of data. And as we create these huge piles of data, we're going to have these data breaches. We're going to have people that are going to, so we're going to have to learn how to deal with this. We're going to have to learn how to deal with the bits and pieces of information, and how we can protect ourselves and also use that effectively. Anyway, let me go back to this for a little bit. So in a way, this is a very early work. Well, early meaning like 2006, because I was generating all these bits and pieces of data. And I'd have these conversations with curators and gallery directors and museum directors, and like, we love your work, but we have no idea what we would show. So so I'm like, well, what do I do? I mean, and you're working as an artist, you have to create some type of things. So the practice of just collecting the information, sure, we can show we can just show the website on a projection, but often that didn't just do that didn't really have the same presence in an exhibition space. So this was a photograph that was all printed up in sections. And so basically this was a sample taken from from the camouflage that we use in warfare today. And I've sampled it out, took out each of the pixels and replaced the pixels with photographs of either current or historic points of conflict. So these two photos right here, these are taken from North Korea. This is inside the Korean DMZ. This is on the anniversary of the Orange Revolution in Kyiv, in Ukraine. This is an interesting little flag. It's a red stripe, a green stripe, and a red stripe. Anybody recognize that flag? Red stripe, green stripe, red stripe. What? No. Iran is red, white, and green. But red, green, red. It's a trick question because this country doesn't exist. It's called Transnistria, or the Russians call it Prednistrovia. It's a tiny sliver. It's a breakaway republic of Moldova, and it's a sliver between Moldova and Ukraine. It's about 20 miles wide, about 200 miles long. But you need to go buy 20 cases of AK-47s. That's the place to go. So this is one little sliver that's caused so much destabilization in the world. So I would actually go in all these places. So you can only imagine what the FBI thinks of, like, I'm coming back to the U.S. after visiting one of these places. I remember coming in CBP, which is Customs and Border Protection. They're like, "What were you doing?" I was like, "Yeah, I was in this part in Moldova for vacation." They're like, "Nobody goes there for vacation." But I'm glad that the guy actually knew that, because otherwise, that would be even crazier. It's kind of funny. Sometimes I would always get pulled over to the side, but there's only one time they asked me to open my laptop, and I was like, "Well, you guys could just look it up online." Like, no, we want to see it. And he's like opening my, he's kind of going through my stuff. I was like, "Well, is there something you're looking for that I can help you find?" It's like, "We want to see your pictures." So he goes to my pictures, and there's like thousands of pictures of just toilets and like random food things and random airports. And he's like, "Where's your vacation pictures?" I was like, "You're looking at them." So I think there was a little confusion going on there. Probably doesn't pull over too many artists in that kind of a situation. Anyway, so I want to show you how some of these works fit in more of an art context. So thinking about the historic concept of the panopticon, where the guard tower was in the center and the prisoners were all around, and the prisoners couldn't see whether they were being monitored or not, and thus the concept of self-regulating your behavior. So one of the things that I did here, so this was at Sundance a few years ago, where there's all these monitors that went all around, all these images, and you were completely surrounded. And one of the things that happens is when you go to these, like, you see in the movies or in the TV, or not necessarily only in the movies, but you also see them in the news about those police monitor stations with all those monitors everywhere and all those. They're not watching all. That's just for like fundraising, because the real stuff's actually happening underneath in software. The stuff is boring. The stuff doesn't look like anything. It's just kind of like the camera's just out there, and okay, it knows what it's supposed to see, and when something goes there that it's not supposed to see, that's when it triggers. You can't possibly be monitoring 40 screens. You're not staring at them. I mean, and if you were, that's a really ineffective way of doing this, because that machine can actually watch this better than the human being. So in a way, when you walk in, you're completely immersed in this field with these hundreds of images that are all around you. And the images were constantly changing to the point where you simply couldn't process. So this utter overwhelming nature that would take place of the images. So in a way, okay, so right around this time I was also doing these other projects, and at this time, so something like this doesn't necessarily seem like it would be related, but it kind of comes back together. You know, kind of like, you know, you're always working in different tangents and different directions, and what might seem disparate directions, a lot of times they come back together. So in 2005, I was invited by the Basque government to do a project out there. And of all the people that can relate to being falsely accused or erroneously accused of being terrorists, it's the Basques. Anything goes wrong in Spain, it's the Basques. You know, whether it's the Basques were involved in it or not, they get blamed for everything. So in this project, took some water, some fresh water, and according to the donor who owns the water company, from the purest spring in the world. So we took the fresh water, emptied it out exactly halfway in the bottle in this vessel, capped it with this cork, which is used for chacoli. Chacoli is a very unique wine that comes from this one little part of the Basque country that this project was taking place in. Capped him off, took him to the edge of the earth, like literally to the edge of the earth, dropped him off, and then they floated back to sea. They floated back to shore where we started from, which is kind of crazy when you think about it, but you know. So the science behind it is that we were sitting at lunch. I was with one of these so this program essentially places artists and designers in these high-tech research centers, and you come up with a project. So we were sitting at lunch with one of the folks from ASTI, and I'm going, hey, Alberto, you know, if I take this bottle and if I chuck it into the sea, can you tell me where it's going to go? He's like, absolutely. You know, so if you think about it, like when we think of this, the message in the bottle, this romantic idea of communication, probably one of the most primitive forms of long-distance communication. And yet these guys are like, no, we know exactly where that's going to go, because that's how we calculate shipwrecks. If we get an SOS from here, we know to look over there, because the winds and the currents will move this from there to there. So, you know, so I was fascinated by this. You know, here's this idea that we thought was this so romantic idea, and yet this is so scientific. So we went to the edge of the earth, which actually is, that's the point. Like if you're standing on shore, it's that part that curves over, and it's that curve that you can no longer see. So we went to that point and released the bottles at an exact time, so there would, an exact weather conditions that would allow the bottles to float back to the shore from where we started from. So this idea of this reverse calling and responding. We tracked the bottles with these GPS buoys, and we took them inside the museum and laid them out. And what happened here was really interesting, because each of the aquariums, so we took the water that was, and when I say we, because these are like huge productions with like multiple people and a lot of scientists, museum people, fabricators, and so we got the water from outside the museum and brought them in and modified the water and put them in these fish tanks to replicate the salinity levels of 31 seas in the world. So, you know, and these guys were great. They're like, hey, what's the salinity level of the Red Sea? They're like 48.2. I mean, they just like knew this stuff off the top of their head. Or what's the Baltic Sea? 17.4. I mean, they just like knew this. And so what we did is we took the existing water from the Cantabrico, which is right in front, and modified it, either by condensation or reduction. And we would modify the salinity levels, and it was amazing because the bottle of the fresh water was exactly identical. So when they would go in, they would float at a different angle. So the Red Sea, they floated almost perfectly horizontal, and the Black Sea, they floated almost vertical. So it was this super scientific way of doing this incredibly lo-fi visualization. I mean, this is basically data visualization. And the scientists, I mean, they were super excited. They're like, oh yeah, that's that ocean, and that's the Straits of Hormuz, and that's the Straits of Magellan. And they just knew this stuff by being able to see the angle of the bottle. So it's kind of like, you know, data viz is a big hot buzzword now and a buzz term, but there's different ways of looking at data viz. And so this was, again, another way of approaching this. I do a lot of work with airports. So a few years ago, I did a project at the Park Avenue Armory. where went in and basically this was this imaginary airport that spanned from sea to sea, and this image was hacked into this piece of marble on the floor. And the reason I'm showing you this is because I want to show you this, which is every airport that I transited through in 2005 and 2006. And the reason that's important is because I'm in the middle of a project that I'm doing for the San Jose airport. And this has been going on for a long time, but so basically San Jose has worked out a deal where when you go to the airport, it's like like in Denver, you'll see like welcome to DIA or whatever. But the airlines often have to pay for those monitors unless they own their gates. And if they don't own their gates, they only buy the time that they need. They don't buy it 24 hours. So the Public Arts Commission there basically worked out a situation where whenever it wasn't going to be showing art, it would be showing, or whenever it wasn't showing airline material, it would be showing art. And so I got hired to do this project, but there's a little catch. In order to be paid for this, I have to be employed by the airport. In order to be employed by the airport, I have to go through a Homeland Security threat assessment. And you have to remember, I've been trying to get the Homeland Security for years to give me something saying I'm okay. And they're just like, no. And journalists have been trying to contact them for years, and like, we don't comment. So I'm going through all this stuff, and basically, so this is the piece, by the way. It's a piece from that piece. There's like 100 videos running in it simultaneously. But I got this in February 21st of 2009. This thing lets me walk around the airport with a Sawzall. I mean, it lets me climb into the ceiling, or at that time it did. So it's kind of ironic how it kind of like goes completely full circle. Let me show you a couple of little bit of pieces in a few minutes. So I've been doing a lot of work, again, looking at visualization. So I ran across a document. It's called Instances of Use of United States Armed Forces Abroad. And this is a congressional document that chronicles every single, it's a congressional report that chronicles every time US troops have been used on foreign soil. And sometimes they're just like, in 1803, Marines chased some pirates onto this Caribbean island. Well, we landed troops on a foreign country, so therefore we technically invaded that country. Or World War II. Everything's just one. Everything's just one. So I mapped all these out. And all the white X's are all the invasions from 1776 to World War I. All the gray ones are from World War I to Vietnam, and all the black ones are Vietnam to today. The number of invasions from 1776 to World War I roughly equal the number of World War I to Vietnam, and the number from 1776 to Vietnam roughly equate the same number as Vietnam to today. So we're doing really good in this incursion. So what I wanted to do for this piece is that I wanted to talk, I was talking to this museum in Spain. I said, why don't we just set up this huge slabs of bulletproof glass, and we'll have a shooter at one end, and they'll just fire, and the bullets would stop in front of people. I knew that this was crazy. I knew that there was no way that they were going to let me do this. But I thought I'd throw it out there. And to my surprise, they said, well, let us think about it. We'll look into it, and we'll get back to you. And then a few days later, they called me and said, you're crazy. There's no way we're doing this. But in the meantime, we did these ballistics tests, which is really cool. So when these things hit glass, they actually melt and they fuse into it. So this piece actually eventually ended up looking like this. And you see, like literally, like in Central America, we invaded so many times, it's a literal wreck. The bulletproof glass kind of started falling apart there. And you see these, like when you touch them, you see the bullets kind of like the dents that they made in them. But this was an interesting piece because we weren't sure whether to fabricate this in the US and ship it over or build it out there because, it's got real gunpowder in it. And we don't know, crossing international borders, whether it gets imported as art or gets imported as firearms. So this one, we decided to build it in Spain. But the problem is there's this pesky law in Spain where you can't discharge a weapon in less than 25 meters of its intended target. So that means you have to be at least 80 feet away. And these things are like a 1/4 inch in diameter. And you need to shoot them exactly from 80 feet away. So I was like, I have no idea how to do it. So the museum hired some former Olympians. And all of them were exactly spot on. There was only 4 that were like off by a 1/4 inch. I'm convinced I just drew them wrong. But it was just scary what they did. Anyway, we probably should wrap up, but I want to show you a couple of other pieces. So I want to show you this piece, and then we can talk about some of the other pieces during Q&A or something. So I've been working with this physicist, Laszlo Barabashi, over at the Center for Complex Network Research in Boston, and they're interested in human in movement. I mean, they're physicists. I mean, they're interested in predictive behavior. So he has data on millions of people. They're generally some type of cell phone data or geolocated data. And if he has your data, he can generally predict your whereabouts between 80 and 93% of the time. So he can tell you on September 25th at 3:35 p.m., you're going to be in this spot. And his accuracy is between 80 and 93% for most people. So he asked me about my data, so I sent it to him. I sent him that spreadsheet, and he sent me back this. This is not a geographic map. This is a probability map. And he said, you keep throwing the system off. I mean, so while everyone else falls in that 80 to 93, I supposedly fall in like 0.04. And I'm thinking, no, this can't be right. And he says, yeah, you keep throwing off our system. So he's convinced that when I got pulled aside by the FBI, that I was so off the norm that at least something, that they saw that. I think he's given them a little too much credit. But nonetheless, this is one. So anyway, so Laszlo sent me back this, and then this turned into this. So, again, taking the data and working as an artist with it rather than a physicist. So, and this is what this came in, and this dome, by the way, is 12 feet in diameter. So this thing is absolutely gigantic. And then, so there's a few other things that are happening. We can go through a few other of the projects in a little bit, but I think we probably should pause right now and take a little bit of a Q&A. But I think there's different ways, and I think one of the things that we'll talk about is that artists approach problems in a very different manner. And I think problem solving from an artist's perspective is not necessarily the same way that the non-artists approach it. So I think that we all have this level of agency that I think we can approach. So I want to leave it at that, and then let's open it up to some questions. Great. Thank you.
Our wireless mic.
Did you ever encounter any problems like being pulled aside by airport security in any other country?
Not in airports. There was one incident on a train in Slovakia where on a Christmas morning somehow I ended up in a jail there. But then they basically just, and then later, like after about 4 hours or something, they just came in and just threw my bag and my passport and they just said, out. I wasn't going to question that, but that's the only other time that's happened. You get basically, oh, actually, no, there are times, actually, I should, so for example, like there's a lot of times that I going to the UK, it's a terrible experience for me, just. There's like, because the thing is in the US, eventually because I'm a US citizen, they have to let me into the country. A lot of other countries, they don't have to let you in. And they can just keep you there, and eventually it gets worked out, but it's often not pleasant. But these days it's totally cool. These days, I got all these types of, like the global entry things and the TSA pre-check. That makes life a lot easier because now the machine tells them that I'm okay. So it's not like, because it's not a human being making that decision. It's like, oh, the machine says you're okay, so you're okay. So in a way, I kind of like that. I love these like speed cameras. In the past, I'd be the guy that gets pulled over, but now, it's like when that discretion is taken out, and it's just this binary yes no, it makes it so much easier. Let me show you this one little thing. Hold on. Let me move this over. I want to show you this piece at the end. So this is a piece called Hawkeye. Hawkeye is AT&T's internal code name for this data center. This, if you look, it's a building, but it's really not it doesn't really have any windows. And the parts that are windows are, those are vents. It's basically a gigantic hard drive. This data center contains back in 2007, it contained 312 terabytes of phone conversations of every phone conversation on AT&T's network. So how in the world do you actually listen to that many phone conversations? You don't. We've externalized this. Now this gets really complicated because if the phone conversation is there, so say you're calling your dad, does that conversation belong to you? Does it belong to your dad, or does it belong to AT&T and they're licensing you the use of it? You see what I'm getting at? This gets really tricky in the legalities of things. And really, kind of what we were talking about earlier is that how do you listen to it? You're not supposed to. It's meant for machine consumption. It's meant for algorithms that search out specific patterns and pull those things in. And when you see this isn't the only one. There's tons of these things. The reason this is important is because this is the building on the 6th floor where we had the NSA wiretap scandal a few years ago. This is pre-Snowden. This was in 2007, where the NSA approached 16 telecom companies and said, hey, we want to copy your data stream. And 15 of the 16 said, sure, help yourself. Set yourself up. There's only one company that said, we're not really sure about the legalities of this. Can you please come back with a warrant? And interestingly enough, that company no longer exists. Shortly after, Bush also retroactively gave them immunity. So basically, they, whatever laws they'd broken, they were forgiven for breaking those laws. I mean, this is scary stuff, and this is not just the only place. We all have this. I mean, we're all creating so many archives and so many points. I mean, your phone is, think about what's in it. Think about all the data that's in it. Think about all the cache that's in your maps, and it knows exactly how long you spent in each of those locations. These things, so our devices, and it's not just your phone. I mean, everywhere you go, every click you make, every time you swipe your card at something, there's something that's being tracked along the way, and all that data is being archived, and because it's so cheap. I mean, when was the last time we actually even delete spam? I mean, I don't know. I mean, mine just kind of sits there, and Gmail does something. I don't know what it does to it. It just kind of sits there, but it just kind of goes away. In the same sense, we just keep adding to it every day. I mean, I think just today, I must have taken, I don't know, 50, 60 images. And tomorrow I'll probably take just as many, and the day after I'll probably take just as many. And they'll just keep accumulating because, well, the hard drive space is infinite. I mean, we can buy 2 terabyte hard drives now for $100, if even that. I mean, way cheaper than that. So storage is no longer a problem. Problem is reading the information and processing it back. But often now we've figured out that we don't necessarily need humans to read it, but we just can have machines do it. Yeah. Sorry, it's really depressing.
Honestly, I feel worse for AT&T if they ever happens to my side. So.
Yeah. But chances are they're probably not listening to you, and they're probably listening to Mohammed, the cab driver. I think we have somebody in the back.
Oh, great.
So I have a feeling that a lot of our best work comes from tension and adversity. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about what your body of work would look like had you not had this experience with the FBI.
Yeah. Well, this is one of the reasons I wanted to show you those really early works at the beginning. And visually, they're actually not that crazy different. I mean, when you look, so this is a brand new piece. This actually hasn't even been shown. This show is opening on Saturday. And this is a photo that the curator sent me that she took with a cell phone. It's like, hey, we just finished installing it, and check this out. So they're like sitting there, I mean, trying to figure out the patterns of moving, putting all these monitors in. And actually, let me show you what this piece looks like. I'll show you the diagram. So this is the diagram that I sent them. Monitor numbers. This is a 13-channel installation, 19 inches from here, 135 inches there, center line there. Bottoms of these monitors line up with that. Please cover bright blue LED light showing, things like that. And then the monitor settings for colors and such. And this is the image. So this was the video that was playing across it. Now, when you look at this pattern, and then say compare that to, let's go way, way, way early to this to 1996, there's a lot of similarities visually. Conceptually, yes, at that time in 96, I may not necessarily have fully understood. I think what my experience with the FBI, I think it gave me an ability to go back into my visual vocabulary and further articulate it in this way. I think one of the things is that I've also been working on this project about a quarter of my life. So when you sit with a project that long, you learn to think about it in different ways, and you learn to reevaluate it. You learn to keep going back and going back. Often we don't have we just go on to the next thing. And granted, I've done that in a lot of other projects, but trying to find that commonality, trying to find that link that goes between all of them, I think this is important. And I think in a lot of ways, conceptually, the works are still very much about immigration. The works are very much about citizenship. The works are very much about civic engagement. Visually, there's a lot of similarities, but I think they've gotten, at least I hope they've gotten more refined. I think visually they've gotten more developed. But there's a lot of similarities. I think the work that I'd be doing would be very similar, but maybe not necessarily I would have this direct personal connection. Because the works in the early, they were really impersonal. They were very cold and detached. Whereas now I'm giving you very personalized information, but I'm giving it to you yet again in this very cold and detached manner, as if it's evidence. Every piece is just the facts. I mean, they all look like, like crime scene evidence. When you look at some of the, like even the way, say like the way the food is photographed, or the way the pieces of data are presented. I mean, you're given a point here, point there, point there, point there, and point there, point there. So not only that's happening conceptually, that's also happening visually. When you get these monitors that are arranged in these patterns and such. So hopefully that answers a little bit of your question.
Why don't you have any pictures of people in your
I don't
photos?
like people. I don't like anybody. No, actually, I think that's kind of the, maybe that's not the answer that you want, but no, really, because there are people that are incidental to the image. Every now and then you'll see some body in it, but they're never the central focus of the image. Because in a way, what I'm hoping with this project is that as the viewer goes through it, that the viewer is really reenacting the role of the FBI agent, of cross-referencing this data point with that data point with that data point, and trying to make sense of these seemingly unrelated points. And by not having people in it, allows the viewer to insert themselves, first as investigator, and hopefully as they're investigating, they come to the realization that they could also be the subject. So it allows entry points that had these been about individuals. This, as autobiographical as this material is, this isn't necessarily about me. This is really more of a reflection of a broader condition that we all live in. I think artists have always, throughout history, been really good at holding up a mirror to their environment, what's around them. So maybe if these look like depressing and desolate images, maybe that's the state of our political beings. Maybe that is the reality of many of our lives. I think this in a way, I think artists and it's not just I mean you can go throughout history, whether we go back way back to the cave paintings, or whether we look at Goya's black paintings, we look at Aesop's fables. There's always been social commentary and social documentary that has been taking place throughout history. And I think this is just another way of looking at that. So my device of not using the person hopefully allows you to insert yourself in various roles throughout this. Anyone else?
Anybody else? Oh, over there. You're going to have to help me out and pass. Thanks, guys.
I guess this question is a little opinion-based, but
okay.
Like with Western culture, through history, I think we might have had or have the tendency of using our technology before we truly understand it. Do you think all these problems are manifesting more within ourselves, or are we truly being abused by those with the power?
Well, I don't think this is just something that applies to Western culture. I think this just applies to, global culture right now. I think the level of technological development that's taking place today, it's operating at such a speed that we really, we don't necessarily know what the full implications are while we're using it. But we're good. We're pretty good at learning how to use it. We're pretty good at adapting. My dad's 69 years old and he's like constantly text messaging me. That we couldn't have had that 20 years ago. But it's something that we've learned. We've learned how to do this. And in the same way, I think, as we learn, we're very adaptive beings. But the problem gets to be not necessarily in the technological aspect or the cultural aspect of it, but really more the policy aspect. When we try to legislate these types of behaviors or these types of technologies. And by the time, because the whole legislative process is so glacially slow that by the time we get to that, our culture and the technology have already moved into a completely different era. Just to give you a very pragmatic example, there's a law that's on the books still today that email and this law was, I think, 1983 or 1982. I mean, does email have any resemblance today than it did in 1980 something? But basically what Congress was discussing most recently was that if your email was left on a server, not just your email, but any kind of digital information for more than 6 months, it was considered abandoned. And because it was abandoned, it really belonged to anybody. You did not have that same protection because you abandoned, you didn't download. But how many of us actually download our emails off of wherever our email servers are? And again, the law just doesn't work that way. By the time we try to discuss policy around these, things have changed so drastically that they no longer have any resemblance to its original form. So I think that's something to keep in mind, and I think that's something that's very problematic in the way. But I think we should give our species a little bit more credit. I think we're really good at keeping up with what the new technological advents are, and we learn very quick.
So I think we can take one more question, if there is any.
Just a quick question, and wondering, do you think that we have lost the ability to assume that we have privacy? Would we be better off assuming we have no privacy?
I'm not sure if it's a matter of that, but I don't think we've lost privacy. But I do think that what we think of as privacy is different. And what we think of what was private and what will be private are two very different things. I think we're in a transition. We're making that transition from analog to digital, and on a cultural level. And our ideas of what we value as private, I think, need to change. It's not a matter of a better or worse. I think what's going to happen is that we just need to have a different understanding that things will be different. And we can't use the measurements and the standards of yesterday to try to understand where our privacy is today and where we'll be tomorrow. So I think I don't think it's a matter of that our privacy has gone away. I don't think we should assume that. No, we still have that. It's just different. And it's a different way that we're interacting and we're managing our privacy. But in a lot of ways, in what I'm doing here is that, when you opt in, that's actually the ultimate form of control and the power. And it's when you decide what is it that you're going to share and what is it that you will not. So I think having that as the first step, I think, is a pretty good beginning of understanding and being mindful of how we relate to privacy in the future.
Thank you, Hasan.
You're very welcome.
I just want to say thank you.